policy of democratic nations, to think ahead, not just to the next week or to the next election, but to think ahead strategically, at least in the next decade or so. Because, you know, some Western experts, some Western pundits like to talk about, in their view, of the fact that the Putin regime is so stable, it's so secure, that it's going to be there, you know, for a long time, if not forever. There was a book that was recently published by a Berkeley professor in California about the later years of the Soviet Union. I haven't read it yet because I was in prison when it came out, but I really love the title. The title is, "It was supposed to be forever until it ended." This is how it always happens with authoritarian regimes. People think they're stable, people think they're strong, people think they're secure, and then bang, one day they're just gone. That's certainly how things happen in Russia. Both the Romanov Empire at the beginning of the 20th century and the Soviet regime at the end of the 20th century went down in 3 days, very literally, not a figure of speech. This is how change happens in Russia. Suddenly, unexpectedly, the snap of a finger, and nobody can see it coming, and nobody's really ready for it. And that was a big problem in the 90s, the fact that nobody was ready for it, neither from the Russian side nor from the Western side. And that's why so many mistakes were made back in the 1990s. And we are living with the consequences of these mistakes today. Not just we in Russia, but also people in Ukraine every single day, and frankly, people across Europe. And so one of the things that has occupied my mind for a long time, but especially these past few weeks that I've been out of prison, is that we have no right to miss the next opportunity for change in Russia when it comes. In fact, we started this discussion, if you can call it that. He wrote from his prison, I wrote from mine. That's how opposition politicians in Russia debate each other these days. With Alexei Navalny, about this time last year, in August, September 2023, when he wrote his article about what he saw as the main mistakes of the 1990s, I wrote mine in response about what I saw as the main mistakes of the 1990s. We can go through this in more detail if that's something that would be of interest. But the point is that we need to learn from those past mistakes. We need to learn from those past lessons to make sure we do not repeat these failures the next time a window of opportunity for change in Russia opens. And we know once again it's going to happen like this. None of us knows exactly when, exactly in what circumstances, but it's going to happen in a very foreseeable future. And next time we must get this right. And to me, this means primarily two things. One more on the domestic side, one more on the international side. On the domestic side, unlike what happened in the 90s when this never really took place, there will need to be a process, if you will, of truth and reconciliation in Russian society. Any country, any society that has successfully transitioned from authoritarianism to democracy, be it Central and Eastern European states after communism, Latin American countries after military dictatorships, South Africa after apartheid, was Germany after 45, and then again in the eastern part after 1989. All of these countries that have successfully transitioned to democracy have necessarily undergone this process of a moral reckoning, of a public reconciliation, of a public accounting of the crimes committed by the old regimes, of the trauma that was imposed on society by years or decades of totalitarianism. You know, archives were opened. There were judicial trials against people responsible for crimes committed against other nations or against peoples in these countries themselves. There were illustrations introduced in many countries, which meant that people who had been responsible for these crimes were no longer able to come anywhere near positions of power, and so on and so forth. We never had that in Russia in the 90s, and that was, in my view, the biggest reason for everything that's been happening since 1999 when Putin came to power. We cannot afford to do this again. The day after Putin, we will need to start that process of a public reckoning with all the crimes that have been and are still being committed as we speak here. Of course, the war crimes in Ukraine, but also the crimes committed against the people of Russia by this regime, the assassination of Boris Nemtsov, the assassination of Alexei Navalny, the persecution of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of political prisoners in Russia. People who are responsible for this need to be brought to account. There needs to be justice. There needs to be accountability. And we must make sure that this evil is never again repeated. Because as history shows very well, and I'm a historian by education myself, if evil is not publicly reflected upon, publicly accounted for, and publicly condemned, it will return. And this is what happened in Russia at the end of the 1990s. We cannot repeat that mistake again. And the second part of that homework, if you will, I believe we must be doing now in time for that future transition in Russia concerns the international aspect. I firmly and fundamentally believe that if we ever want to see Europe that is whole, free, and at peace with itself, that is only going to be possible with a democratic Russia. There's no other way. Russia is the largest country in Europe. That is always going to remain a geographic fact. And so the only way, as I'm firmly and fundamentally convinced, to achieve long-term peace, stability, and security on the European continent is with a peaceful, free, and democratic Russia as a part of that equation. And so we must also be thinking about and preparing a roadmap for a future reintegration of a changed, different, post-Putin democratic Russia back into Europe, back into the civilized world, back into what we call the international rules-based order. That is going to be not just in our interests in Russia, but it's going to be first and foremost in the interest of Ukraine, because there's not going to be a stable, peaceful, and secure Ukraine unless there is a peaceful and democratic Russia, while there's a murderous and aggressive dictatorship that is in power in the Kremlin. And it's going to be in the interests of the whole of Europe and, frankly, of the whole of the world. And that has been the topic of my conversations with various heads of state and government of these past few weeks, including just this morning here across the street with Prime Minister Keir Starmer. So I think I'll stop there in terms of the introduction. I thank you all very much for being here, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you wish to ask. Thank you.
Vladimir, I wonder if I could abuse my privilege as a chair to just ask to start with one question that struck me from your interview with Le Monde, at least as it was published last week, where you said that the West missed an opportunity in the early 1990s. I think you said there was the Council of Europe, but there wasn't much else. Now, the article didn't actually specify more about what you said, but since you say that there cannot be a Europe whole and free without Russia, what did we miss in the West in the early 1990s that we could have done so we didn't end up in the kind of mess we are now?
Thank you for this. That's a fundamental question that goes to the core of sort of the issue that I was raising. I have many friends in the Central and Eastern European states and the Baltic states, including in the political circles, including in parliaments and governments and so on. And each and every one of them tells me how important it was for them back in the 1990s when they were undergoing through the post-communist transition, through the difficult, very difficult democratic and market reforms, how important it was for them to have that promise of European and Euro-Atlantic integration, that light at the end of the tunnel that served as a very powerful incentive for them to persevere, to continue, and to see these reforms through to success. Václav Havel spoke of the entire post-communist transformation in Czechoslovakia in terms of our return to Europe. This was the phrase that he used. Russia never really had that promise back in the early 1990s. Yes, there were some very important symbolic steps, such as the admission to the Council of Europe and adherence to the European Convention on Human Rights, and so on. But there was never really any prospect or any promise of what I would call first-tier European Euro-Atlantic integration, things such as free trade, visa-free travel, common economic space, and security guarantees, and so on and so forth. I'll give just one specific example. There are many, but I'll give one which I find the most striking. In December of 1991, a few days before the Soviet Union formally ceased to exist, it was still around, but everybody knew its days were numbered. Actually, this was the 20th of December of 1991, 5 days before the red flag would finally be put down on the Kremlin. There was a North Atlantic Council meeting in Brussels at NATO headquarters. And the Russian ambassador, still formerly the Soviet ambassador, came in, and he handed a letter from President Boris Yeltsin of Russia, addressed to NATO Secretary General Manfred Werner. And in that letter, the President of Russia has, for the first time, publicly and officially raised the question of future Russian membership in NATO. That letter did not even get a response. A few years ago, I was writing a piece on this general topic, And I went to the archives, the Library of Congress in Washington and so on, just to sort of look back through sources, through contemporary press reports, through documents, to see how is it possible that there wasn't even a response. And what all the contemporary reports and sources come down to in the end is the fact that Western leaders and NATO officials were so taken aback by the very possibility of this, they hadn't even considered it, they hadn't even thought of this, that they scrambled to put together a coherent response, so they didn't give any. There are many such examples. For those of you interested in this topic in detail, I would recommend a book that came out a few years ago now, just shortly before my arrest. It's a memoir by Andrei Kozyrev, who served as Russian foreign minister from 1990 to 1996 in those very important formative years. It's called Firebird. It's out in English and in Russian. In this, he recalls from the first person all of these things that I'm talking about. But the bottom line is that a very important opportunity was missed, not just by us on the Russian side. I've already discussed this at length in the introduction, but a very important opportunity was also missed on the side of the West, on the part of the West that was not ready to welcome and embrace that nascent democratic Russia in the same way as it was ready to embrace and welcome the nascent democratic Poland, the Czech Republic, or the Baltic states, and so on. And I think that was a fundamental mistake that also in many ways led to the situation where we are today. And the importance of discussing this to me, and I'm a historian, I love discussing the past, but that's not the point. The point is that we have to learn from these mistakes and not repeat them the next time the opportunity comes. Because, again, to reaffirm this, I fundamentally believe that the only way that we can make Europe whole, free, and at peace with itself would be with a free, peaceful, and democratic Russia as a part of it. And it's really important to be thinking now about that future roadmap for reintegrating, for the day after Putin, if you will, for reintegrating a changed post-Putin democratic Russia back into Europe and back into the international community, because that's going to be in the interest of everyone. And we cannot afford to miss that opportunity again, so that the next generation will again have to be dealing with the problems that we are all dealing today.
Thank you very much for that. Let me remind you, please catch my attention, wait for the microphone, and introduce yourself. Edward Lucas.
Yes. Hello, Vladimir. Very good to see you back. I think this question of the 1990s can seem quite arcane. Perhaps there are some people in the room who don't remember it as clearly as some of the rest of us. But you're right, it's absolutely relevant to what's happening now. But I think there's a different angle on this. The Estonian president, Lennart Meri, gave a speech in December 1994, just 30 years ago, where he warned with prescient clarity of the dangers of the trajectory that Russia was going in. He highlighted militarism, imperialism, anti-Westernism, corruption, all on a much smaller scale than we were to see under Putin, but it was all visible there in the 90s. And he and other leaders, including Václav Havel, from many others from the region, were all warning back then that this is going in the wrong direction and saying, don't sell us out. Don't sell out our interests in an attempt to befriend this supposedly democratic, supposedly peaceful, supposedly post-imperial Russia. And my question really is, how do you deal with those worries are still here now? You hear them very strongly from Ukrainians, Estonians, Latvians, also Finns, Swedes, and others, who say there will be a kind of fake Potemkin liberalization after Putin goes, where the West will be so eager, as it always is, to make friends with the new Russian regime, that they will throw the long-term interests of European security under a bus. And then in a few years' time, we'll find that the new leader isn't quite as nice as we thought, a mistake that we, I'm afraid, have made in the past.
Thank you so much, Ed, and it's absolutely wonderful to see you. I really mean this. Great to see you here. Thank you for raising this. I remember that speech by President Meri very well. This was, as you said, in 1994, the same year when the first war in Chechnya began. This was, by then, already way too late for the things that I've been talking about. Those windows of opportunity, as you know very well, historically are very short and very small. And the real window of opportunity in Russia was, in my view, 91, 92. That's when the opportunity had to be seized. And to your example of President Meri's speech, I would give another example of another speech that was made earlier, 2 years earlier, in 1992 in Stockholm. This was the annual conference of what was then called the CSC, the Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, now the OSCE. And at that event, at that gathering of foreign ministers from all the CSC states, then Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kozyrev made a very risky, let's put it that way, diplomatic move. He came out onto the lectern in front of all the foreign ministers from the CSC states, and without any warning, as if he was speaking officially on behalf of the Russian Federation, he began to say all the things. I see you nodding, you remember that speech. He began to say the things that would be happening in Russia if the hardliners, the nationalists, the sort of post-communist nostalgia people were to achieve power. He was talking about, Russia's traditional interest in the so-called near abroad, about the fact that we cannot fully apply democratic norms from the CSC and the Council of Europe. He would be talking about the special path of Russia that would be different from the rest of European democracies and so on. The assembly was stunned because, of course, Kozyrev was somebody who was the face of a very pro-Western, pro-European foreign policy under President Yeltsin. And then he came down and he sat at his table. The room was in full silence. And 5 minutes later, he asked for the floor again. And he came out and said, of course, I didn't mean any of the things I just said, but this is what will happen if we miss this window of opportunity and if we allow those nostalgic post-communists and imperialists to come back to power again. And I think the time that you're referring to in the mid-90s, that window of opportunity was already lost. And this actually exactly reinforces my point that it will be short, it will be brief, it will be very small again the next time. And we will need to seize it. And on your second point about the fake Potemkin liberalization, I fully agree with you on this. And this is why I always talk about the two sides of this. And before I talk about reintegrating a post-Putin democratic Russia back into the West, back into Europe, I say the first and most important part is that there needs to be genuine change, not the Potemkin one that we had in the 1990s in many ways. There will need to be full opening of the archives and full public discussion of the crimes committed both under the Soviet regime, because that never really happened to the extent it should have back in the 90s, and of all the crimes committed under the Putin regime and still being committed today. There will need to be full accountability for everybody who's responsible for war crimes committed and are still being committed against Ukrainians every single day. These people will need to be brought to justice. There's no question about this. All the occupied territories will need to be returned. I mean, I'm just saying things that are obvious, but I think it's important to say them. I'm talking about a genuine change in Russia, not a fake, as you eloquently put it, fake Potemkin liberalization, which is a change in faces, but not the substance. That is not what I'm talking about at all. And you know me for many years that, I would never talk about anything like this. Once there is genuine change in Russia, there also, in my view, has to be a genuine effort on the part of the West to reintegrate that Russia back into Europe, back into the civilized world. There's a reason why the Morgenthau Plan in relation to Germany in the 1940s, which was about deindustrializing, dismembering, isolating post-war Germany, was replaced by the Marshall Plan, which was about helping to rebuild Germany and becoming a successful market economy and liberal democracy, because Allied leaders, Western Allied leaders, Americans and British leaders, first and foremost at the time, realized that the only way to have lasting peace and security in the western part of Europe will be with a strong, successful and democratic Germany, not a weak, isolated and dismembered one, because that was tried after the First World War, and we know what that led up to. We need the same kind of thinking with regard to the post-Putin Russia. I understand the emotion. Trust me, I understand the emotion. I was in prison because of it, because I couldn't stay silent after the bombing of the maternity ward in Mariupol in March of 2022. I understand the emotion. But we cannot base long-term strategic policy on emotion. It has to be rational, it has to be intellectual, it has to be driven by the actual interests of Europe, of the world, and of humanity. And those interests, in my fundamental view, demand that there be a plan, a roadmap for helping to rebuild and reintegrate Russia from the ruins where the Putin regime is going to leave it. We already see that very clearly today. And thanks for that question.
Tessa?
Yeah, hi. My name is Tessa Szyszkowicz. I work for an Austrian weekly called Falter. Forgive me to bring it a little bit to 2024. One of the things that is really important now is to organize the Russian opposition in exile. And it seems that it's quite splintered, and there's also a lot of infighting. Can you comment on the suspicion that the former oligarch and Putin critic Leonid Nevzlin is behind the attack on Leo Volkov? I mean, is that even a possibility that you would think could be a credible way of solving conflicts in between the opposition?
Thank you for that question. I'm still catching up on 2.5 years worth of information vacuum, sitting in solitary confinement in Siberia. It's been quite a lot of catching up in the past 6 weeks, overwhelmed with information in so many different ways, including all these debates and arguments, and also including this very shocking information. That's the only way I can describe it that you are referring to. I have known Leonid Nevzlin personally for many years. I was absolutely shocked to read all this information that came out. I think that would be the normal reaction of any human being. I do not know whether that's true or not. Thankfully, this issue is being dealt not by the Basmanny justice in Putin's Russia, but by actual, genuine judicial and law enforcement systems in democratic countries that are members of the European Union. I fully trust those judicial processes. I fully trust those law enforcement systems to get to the bottom of it and determine what actually happened. Until then, everything that we say would only be speculation. But again, on a human level, I was completely shocked to read about this, and it is my hope, and in fact, my belief, that the law enforcement mechanisms of, in this case, I believe it's Poland and Lithuania, right, that are dealing with this, and their judicial systems will get to the bottom of this and will determine what actually happened. I have full confidence that they will be able to do so. Right, I've met some colleagues, but not many, again, because it's only been 6 weeks, and it took a couple of weeks just to, frankly, to reconnect with my family, because I wasn't allowed to call my wife or my children in my time in prison. So that was a process, and it still is a process. It's not going to be quick. And then the past 4 weeks or so have just been whirlwind travel around important capitals, Washington, Berlin, Paris, now here in London. I've met some of my colleagues, as I mentioned. I'll meet some of them in the next couple of days here in London too. I'm still also in touch, obviously, with many friends and colleagues back in Russia. This is a new situation for me that I'm now outside, because it's always been a question of principle for me that a Russian politician has to remain in Russia. This is why I didn't leave after the war began. But with that exchange, nobody asked us. They just took us out of prison and herded us on a plane like cattle and threw us out. So it's a new situation for Ilya Yashin. It's a new situation for Andrei Pivovarov. It's a new situation for me. We're only adjusting to this. And we will see how and what can be done in these circumstances. But I have always been of the belief that any differences, any arguments, any bickering, if I may use that word, among the various opposition representatives, various opposition leaders in Russia, they just completely pale in significance in comparison to the common struggle that we have against an aggressive, murderous dictatorship that is sitting in the Kremlin for the past 25 years. And so I hope we can find ways of reconciling those differences and find ways of at least talking to each other in a civilized way and sitting around the same table and finding solutions to the problems that are the most important today. And any differences we can have, and that we do have, I think can be resolved in a future democratically elected parliament of Russia, in a way it's done in your country and all the other normal democratic nations.
If it's any consolation, I remember discussions, and I think Edward would remember discussions as well, about opposition in East European countries during the 70s and the 80s, when people also dismissed them as completely irrelevant and split and penetrated by the security services, etc., etc. And it was like that, but then it wasn't. The gentleman over there.
Thank you, Federico Gatti, Mediaset Italian Television. Thank you for being here today to share this testimony. We have been talking about the past. You just spoke about the future. I hope you forgive me if I bring the conversation to what's being discussed today. You met the Prime Minister this morning. He's been advocating for the use of long-range missile into the Russian territory. Yesterday, the European Union voted in favor of that, in spite of some division, internal division, and I would like to ask you a comment on also on the division within the European institutions. We have to wait November to see what the US will decide, but I wanted to ask you a view on an issue that is involving ultimately your country. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I know there are divisions. I know there are differences of opinion within the Western world, within the EU, within NATO on how to approach Ukraine. The last media interview I gave before my arrest, this was the day before, this was on the 10th of April, 2022. I was at my home in Moscow just speaking by video. I think it was to NBC, the American news channel. I said to them that whatever happens, Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to win the war in Ukraine. And I'm repeating that message again now, since my release. Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to win this war in Ukraine. More than that, he must not be allowed to have a face-saving exit from this war. Because, this man has been in power for 25 years. And ever since he came to power, he brought with him death, blood, suffering, pain, murder, and war. This is who he is. He is never going to change. And if he's allowed a face-saving exit from this war, then a year or two down the line, we'll be talking about another one, another invasion, another aggression, another crime that his regime will be committing. So the only strategic endgame, the only strategic solution to this crisis is to have a different Russia, is to have a government in Russia that would respect the rights and freedoms of our own people, and that would respect the civilized norms of international behavior. A government that would be legitimate and democratically elected. Vladimir Putin is neither. He's neither elected, because we haven't had a free election in decades, nor is he legitimate, because he has stayed in power in direct violation of the constitutional term limits. For all the bureaucratic gimmicks he tried to go around them, it's a very clear violation, as has been recognized both by the European Parliament and by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in their official decisions on this matter. And it's important to keep that strategic endgame in mind. Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to win in Ukraine. And as regards everything that's happening with the missiles and the incursion into the Kursk region, I think it's important to remember that all of these tragedies, all of this pain, all of this suffering that have been inflicted on the people of Ukraine, on the people of Russia, there's one culprit in all of this. There's one culprit, and his name is Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. Ms. Black.
Hi, Vladimir, it's great to see you here. My name's Latika Burke. I'm a writer for the Australian publication, The Nightly. I have two questions, just picking up on what you're saying there. One of the explanations for some of the Western trepidation is they're not sure, or they're afraid of who comes after Vladimir Putin. Who, in your view, comes after Vladimir Putin? What does the day after in Russia look like that you spoke about? And who is leading that democratic movement? Is it yourself? Secondly, are you concerned that the terms of your release will justify and vindicate authoritarian regimes conducting hostage diplomacy and snatching journalists off the streets so that they can free their own thugs, and also, of course, you in the process?
As well.
Thank you. Thank you so much for both questions. I'll start with your second one. I understand fully that the release that brought freedom to me and to 15 others from, who had been kept in Putin's gulag was a very difficult decision, and that there was important moral doubt for many people, because it was an unequal exchange. Because on the one side, there were the people who were completely innocent, because none of the 16 who were released from Putin's prison has ever committed any crime. Our only crime was to have an opinion that's different from Putin's government. And on the other side, there were actual criminals who had to be released, the spies, the hackers, and the murderers. At least one murderer, Putin's hitman assassin, Vadim Krasikov, or so-called Vadim Krasikov, because that's probably not his real name, who was held in Berlin. I understand that. And this is a point that I made to Chancellor Scholz in our very first conversation when he greeted all of us at or at least the Russians and the Germans. The Americans had flown to the US, but the Russians and the Germans, we were brought to Bonn, and he greeted us there at the plane. We had our first meeting in the airport that night. And that's the point I made to him, that I understand that this was a very, very difficult decision. But To me, democracy is about difficult decisions. You know, easy decisions are for dictatorships, where everything is decided like this, just on a whim. Democracy is about difficult decisions. But what, to me, is the biggest difference between a democracy and a dictatorship is that there can be nothing more valuable or more important for a democracy than human life. And as a result of the exchange that happened on the 1st of August, 16 human lives, 16 human souls were saved from the hell that is Russia's modern-day gulag. Isn't that worth releasing one assassin? And I think it's important also, it's sort of almost misleading to speak about prisoner exchanges, because it wasn't a prisoner exchange, it was a life-saving operation. And we need to look at it this way. We need to look at it this way going forward, because, as I mentioned, I've referred to some of the names in the introduction. For so many of these people, it is a question of life or death. And there is this tradition going back decades. This is nothing new. The first such prisoner exchange involving liberating a political prisoner from then the Soviet Union happened in 1976, nearly half a century ago. This was Vladimir Bukovsky for Louis Korvalan exchange in Zurich in December 1976, also with the mediation of the American government, just as this time. And there's this long and noble tradition of democratic countries stepping in to save the lives, not secure the freedom, to save the lives of prisoners of conscience kept behind bars by dictatorships. And this needs to continue. Because again, to my mind, there can be nothing more valuable or more important for democracy than saving human lives. And we should continue doing this. The argument that such exchanges only encourage, the taking of more prisoners, it's a fallacious one. Putin's going to take more prisoners, whatever it takes. He's already taking them. We have a record number of political prisoners in Russia today, more than 1,300 people, according to human rights groups. That's a number that's higher than for the entire Soviet Union toward its later years in the 1980s. This is only for Russia, 1,300 people. He's arresting people not because he wants to do exchanges, but because he's afraid of the truth. He's afraid of people who talk about the war. He's afraid of people who are opposed to the war. He's putting them in prison for that reason. So he's going to put people in prison whatever happens. The only question is, will Western democracies be prepared to do something to save them, or will they just let them die off in Putin's gulag? That's the only question. And so we must continue with these exchanges. And on your first question, and thanks for referencing that, to me, an astonishing argument that we still hear from some people in the West, that, people don't know who's going to come after Putin. Maybe it's going to be worse. I've heard this myself a few times in the last few weeks. I mean, to be honest with you, it sort of feels really bizarre that we have to respond to this in 2024. I mean, what can be worse than a deranged dictator with a nuclear bomb who is destroying a peaceful country in the middle of Europe, who is imprisoning hundreds and hundreds of people, who is murdering his political opponents? Can anything be worse than that, really? I'd like to see what it is. And so that argument is just totally false. It's not even an argument. It's just something that people use because I guess they're ashamed to just openly defend Putin. So they say, oh, but something could be worse than this. So I don't think that's even, frankly, worth responding to in any kind of substance. But on your very important question of who comes after Putin, I think a much more appropriate way to frame the question would be, what comes after Putin? Because we have had this mindset in Russia for years, and a lot of Russians ask exactly the same question the way you asked it. Who comes after Putin? Because for many decades, for many centuries, we've lived with this mentality that there's one single ruler, right? It's been czars, it's been general secretaries, it's been presidents, but at the end of the day, it has always come down to one person, usually one man, sometimes women, like in the 18th century, but holding all the levers of power. And that just hasn't really worked out well in Russia, with one individual holding all the levers of power. The system is wrong. And our goal as the Russian democratic opposition is not to replace a bad czar with a quote-unquote good czar. There's no such thing as a good czar. There are no good czars. There's a growing consensus now in Russian civil society, in Russian opposition forces, and this goes back to your previous question as well about the divisions and arguments in the opposition. There's a growing consensus that the post-Putin Russia must have a parliamentary system, not a presidential one, because it hasn't worked well in our country with one person holding all the levers of power. One of the last pieces published by Alexei Navalny before he was murdered was his article in the Washington Post at the end of last year, where he very persuasively, very eloquently argues for a parliamentary republic in Russia, for a parliamentary setup. So to me, that's the real question. It doesn't matter who it is. It doesn't matter what the name of that person will be. We might even not even know that name. It might be, it might be somebody from among the tens of thousands of people who turned up early this year in February for the memorial events and the funeral procession of Alexei Navalny. It could be somebody we do not even know, but somebody who will be able to win a free and fair and competitive election in Russia whenever it's held. That's, to me, the real question. And Russia post-Putin must be a parliamentary democracy. And whatever the name of the person happens to be prime minister, to me, that's not important.
Gentleman over there.
I am the correspondent in London for the Italian newspaper Corriere della Sera. I have two questions. They are linked some way. First of all, do you think that the Ukrainian offensive in the Kursk region and the targeting of objectives deep into Russia is actually undermining the political authority of Putin more than we actually perceive, and it could accelerate the demise of his regime quicker than we think? And secondly, in that case, after that, you say you dream of a democratic Russia integrated in Europe. But I'm afraid Russia has no democratic tradition. Russia has always been an autocracy. And as an historian, you know very well that Russia history is radically different from the history of Europe, and also from a geographical point of view. Russia is not a European country in the sense of Poland or the Baltic states. Russia is a Eurasian power. So don't you think that your dream is a bit detached from the realities of history and geography, and that the West should deal with Russia as it is, not as we dream it should be?
Right, the last line is a perfect description of what Putin verstehe in the West. Now, I know it's not your view, I know you're just transmitting it, but that's the perfect sort of line that Putin apologists in the West usually do. And so I'll start with your second question. Back in 1982, more than 4 decades ago, just a few hundred meters from where we are sitting today in the Palace of Westminster, US President Ronald Reagan was giving his very famous Westminster address, in which he touched this very point, not in relation to Russia, in relation to the whole world. And he said, and to me, those are the most eloquent words ever spoken on this subject. He said, "It is cultural condescension, or worse, to suggest that there's any nation on the face of this earth that would prefer slavery to freedom." I fundamentally reject that argument that there are just some countries that don't do democracy. Some countries are just not made to be democratic. Reagan was really diplomatic when he called it cultural condescension. I call it racism. Let's just be plain about it. There are some countries that just are forever doomed to live under autocracy. Your country, Italy, was once a fascist dictatorship. Look at it today. It's a successful and thriving over democracy. The same can be said about Spain. The same can be said about Germany. The same can be said about so many countries in Latin America, South Africa. So many countries have been dismissed that they just can't do democracy. That's not what they're about. And look at them today. There's absolutely no reason that Russia should be any different. We are no worse, no better either, than any other European nation and people. And by the way, we are a European country. Russia is a European country. Geographically, it's the largest country in Europe, even if you only take the part west of yours, but that's not even the point. To me, the definition of Europeanness is not only about geography. It's about the culture. It's about the mentality. It's about belonging to the European civilization. I don't think anybody can have any doubt that Russia, look at our music, look at our literature, look at our culture, look at our history, look at the last, at least, 5 centuries of Russian history. We are inextricably a part of European culture and European civilization. There's absolutely no doubt about this. Putin's people want to pretend that Russia is not European because that's their pseudo-ideological basis for justifying political repression, for justifying the lack of free elections, for justifying the lack of independent media. Oh, we are different. We have a special path. We can't do European democracy. This is what the Putin propagandists say to try to explain the way that they're trying to misrule the country. I hope people in the West don't fall for that lie, because that is a lie. And you say that Russia has no democratic traditions. I'm sorry, I'm a historian. That is simply just not true. What about the democratic republics in the cities of Novgorod and Pskov that were Hanseatic cities? What about the elected local self-government that was first introduced in the 18th century under Catherine the Great? What about the great reforms of Alexander II in the 19th century with the introduction of a trial by jury, of freedom of universities, of the abolition of serfdom, of the elected local self-government in the cities and in the provinces? What about our constitutional monarchy in the early 20th century with the parliament, freedom of the press, freedom of political parties? Russia had universal suffrage for parliamentary elections before the UK, before France, before the US. This is a historical fact. Go and check it out if you don't believe me. So this is just simply false to say that Russia has no democratic traditions. Yes, we've had some very bad autocratic traditions too, but they are competing in our history, just as they're competing in the history of your country and many others. So again, that's a very convenient cop-out for people like Putin and his ideological allies to say, we've always been like this and we always will continue to be like this. That is false, that is insulting also to me as a Russian, but most importantly, this just does not correspond to historical facts. And on your first question about the incursion of Ukrainian forces in Kursk, right? We all remember what the goal of Putin was when he launched the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. He wanted to take Kiev in 5 days. Well, 2.5 years on, not only did he not take Kiev in 5 days or in 2 years, but we now have, for the first time since the Second World War, foreign troops on actual, real, international recognized Russian territory. And that is, I mean, slap in the face is too weak of an expression. That's a public humiliation for any dictator, let alone a dictator that tries to base the whole so-called legitimacy of his rule on these aggressive conquests. The Putin propaganda is trying to hush it up for obvious reasons. And I think it's important for the free world to step up and help get this message through to the people of Russia about what's actually happening. And on your point, on your question of whether this humiliation could accelerate the changes in the collapse of the regime, that's actually exactly the point that I was making earlier, that Vladimir Putin must not be allowed to win the war in Ukraine. First and foremost, because it's an unjust war, it's an aggressive war, it's a war that must not succeed, that goes without saying, but also because, and again, this is me speaking as a historian, if we look at the last couple of centuries of Russian history, we have seen that failed wars of aggression have always served as triggers of political change and political democratization. The Crimean War in the mid-19th century and the failure in that war led to the greatest period of liberal reforms under Alexander II, which I already referenced. The disastrous Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century led to the introduction of a constitutional monarchy with a parliament and freedom of the press and freedom of political parties. And something that happened within my own lifetime, the humiliation for the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 1980s was a major factor in leading to the collapse of the Soviet system. This is why in his greatest book, The Gulag Archipelago, which I reread very carefully and very attentively in prison, Alexander Solzhenitsyn writes, «Благословенны не победы в войнах, а поражения в них. Blessed are not the victories in wars, but the defeats». This is what he means. This is what he means. And so again, I reiterate that message again and again. Vladimir Putin must lose the war in Ukraine. And that will open a window of opportunity for positive democratic change in Russia. And then we will need to be ready to seize that chance and next time to get it right.
Thank you. The lady over there at the back.
Hi, Vladimir. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Lisa Hazel. I'm from the Spectator magazine here in London. My question is to do with what you're talking about, the fall of authoritarian regimes and how quickly that can come about. You spoke about the Russian Revolution and the fall of the Soviet Union. Those had large popular swells, I suppose, of support. There was large popular movement behind both of those. So I was wondering, to what degree do you think the same might apply here in Russia today, or when the time comes? And linked to that, what could or should the West be doing, I suppose, as you touched on, I think, in your answer just now, to get that message through to Russian people that the West doesn't want to isolate Russian people in itself? And yeah, how does the West counter that internal propaganda that really does still have a really strong grip on quite a few people in Russia? Thank you.
Just the first part of the question.
Sorry?
Could you repeat just the first part?
Of course. To what degree do you think that there will be a sort of a ground up popular, I don't know, uprising, I suppose, or sort of a movement of the people as opposed to it being a sort of, I don't know, internal Kremlin coup?
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for two very important questions on the sort of ground up popular movement. And this goes to the wider question of public opinion in Russia. And, some people in sort of Western expert circles like to point to opinion polls, for example, in Russia, to say that there's no there's no basis to expect any positive change. You know, everybody supports Putin, everybody supports the war. Well, first, to make the obvious point, opinion polls are absolutely meaningless and irrelevant under a repressive dictatorship when people, first of all, lack access to objective information, and secondly, well, know that there'll be consequences for giving responses. And I mean this in a very literal sense. 2 days ago, at the end of last week, this week, 2 days ago, a man was sentenced to 5 years in prison in Moscow for responding to an opinion poll question on the streets that he was against the war in Ukraine. He got 5 years for that, for one response. So next time somebody talks about opinion polls in Russia, it's important for people to remember things like this. The way to, in my view, the way to assess and judge the actual state of public opinion in Russia is to sort of look at the glimpses that we see from time to time. I saw many of them, surprisingly, but nevertheless, while I was in prison, I was receiving thousands of letters every month from all over Russia, from people I never knew, from places I'd never been to, some of them I hadn't even heard of. People just taking their time to write a few words of solidarity and support. Not afraid, by the way, to register their names and their addresses in the official prison correspondence system, because that's the only way you can write somebody who's in prison. I'll never forget how in February, when Alexei Navalny was murdered, tens of thousands of people all over Russia went to these spontaneous demonstrations of remembrance, and the funeral procession in Moscow also had tens of thousands of people who were chanting "No to Putin, no to war," knowing that there will be police officers and security agents everywhere with cameras, and that people's names will be taken, their faces will be recorded, and many people were saying goodbyes to their loved ones that morning because they weren't sure if they'll ever come back home, but they still went. I'll never forget how also this February, during a so-called presidential election campaign, when there was Putin and a couple of handpicked clowns alongside him on the ballot, there was one candidate, a lawyer, former member of parliament, Boris Nadezhdin, who announced that he was running on an anti-war platform. And the public response was just unbelievable. I mean, the whole of the month of February, I was getting letters about that. That was the subject number one, because people were writing to me. And then now that I've got out, I've seen the photos and videos, and it is amazing. In cities and towns, large and small, suddenly there were hours-long queues of people who wanted to leave their signatures on the petitions to get this guy on the ballot. And most of them were young people. And of course, he wasn't allowed on the ballot. Opposition candidates never are in Putin's Russia. But that was almost beside the point, because what was important was for people to see that they're not alone. There was this one young lady who wrote to me from the town of Novorossiysk in the south of Russia on the Black Sea. And she was describing, how she stood for 3 or 4 hours just to leave a signature for Nadezhdin's nomination. And she ended that letter by saying, "I didn't realize how many of us there are." Because Putin's propaganda tries to, depress people and demoralize people and just pretend that everybody's for Putin, everybody's for the war. And those of us who think like we do are just some sort of a small, irrelevant, marginal minority. At best, or at worst, we're all traitors and Western paid stooges, right? That's the message from Putin's propaganda. And it's so important to have these glimpses of reality, to see what people in Russia actually believe and how they actually feel, including about this war. And so to your question about a popular grounds up movement, when the moment comes, I have no doubt that there will be one, just as we saw it in August 1991, when hundreds of thousands of peaceful, unarmed people went out on the streets of Moscow and literally stood in front of the tanks. And the tanks stopped and turned away. We have seen this. We've seen this in Czechoslovakia with the Velvet Revolution, across Eastern Central Europe at the end of the 80s, early 90s. It wasn't happening just 2 or 3 years before, because the conditions weren't there. They aren't there in Russia today, but it doesn't mean that they won't be there in a few months' time or in a couple of years. So I have no doubt that when that moment of opportunity comes, there will be large popular backing in Russia for change. Because you know what, frankly, a lot of people are just fed up with Putin. He's been in power for 25 years. So somebody of your age would not even remember any other political reality in that country. All they know is him. All they know is just seeing that one face on the television screens for their entire lives. We have people in Russia who were born, went to kindergarten, went to school, went to university, got married, had children, started the profession. All this time, is one man has been in power. I don't know how many prime ministers I can't count how many have changed in this country in all this time. And that's normal.
Quite a few in the last few years.
Right, and I know you're laughing about it, but you know what? I take this any day over what we have. So this is to your first question. And thank you so much for the second question, because that's important. Because far too often, and again, this is all new for me, because I'm only catching up on this in the last 6 weeks. Because, when I was in prison, my only sources of information was a little radio on the wall of the prison cell, which you can imagine what that was. The Russian state radio was just daily propaganda morning till night. All the letters I would receive, but of course, those went through the prison censorship systems, right? So people had to be careful what they would write, or if they were not careful, the letters just wouldn't get through. So I've been catching up on a lot of this, but in these past 6 weeks, I've sort of come across, I wouldn't say it's not a sort of a prevailing narrative by any means, don't get me wrong here. But there are voices in the West and in the European Union who are sort of not really making a distinction between the Putin regime, the Putin dictatorship, and Russia as a whole, and lumping that together. And that's actually sort of just parroting the Putin propaganda, but from the other side. Because the Putin's propaganda machine is trying to say, everybody's in Russia is for Putin, everybody in Russia is for the war. And some of the critics of Putin and the EU are sort of doing the same from the other side. All these Russians, they're all imperialists, they all support Putin, they all support the war. And that, not only is that not true, as we already discussed, but it's also very demoralizing for people to hear, for those people who think like me, for those people who are against this dictatorship, for those people who are against this war. And to your question about the messaging, I think it's very important for the democratic world, and this is what I've also been discussing with presidents and prime ministers that I've met over the past few weeks. It's very important for the democratic world to find a way to communicate directly with the people of Russia over the head of the Putin regime, to send a message that they're not against Russia as a society, not against the people of Russia, and that there will be a place for a new changed post-Putin Russia in the civilized world, in Europe and the international community. And it's important for the free world to send a message to the people of Russia, not that we hate you and we want to destroy you, because of course the Putin propaganda amplifies every such narrative, and that only goes to play into the hands of the Putin propaganda. But the message should be that life for the people of Russia would be better without Putin and after Putin than it is today. And it is that message that needs to be heard loud and clear, because if we're looking for any strategic solutions to this, not just to freeze it and push it on to the next generation, but any strategic solution to this crisis that we're all living through, has to have a Russian component. It can't be any other way. And millions of Russians who are against Putin and against the war are allies of the Western world in this, not enemies. And it's important to make that distinction. Thank you for the questions.
I should say that we've got no more than 20 minutes from now. So I would ask everyone who asks a question to do so very briefly, so I can accommodate as many as I can.
Did Starmer and Lamy give you any indication that they are thinking seriously about a Russia strategy and for a post-Putin Russia? Yeah, as much as you're willing to say on that matter.
At the moment, they're not thinking about it.
Just a question about whether they are actually thinking about it.
Thank you, Tom. Good to see you again. And in the spirit of our moderator's advice, I'll answer very briefly. Obviously, I'm not at liberty to disclose the details of the conversation because it was a private conversation, but the answer to your question is yes, on both counts, both for the Foreign Secretary and for the Prime Minister.
Very good. The gentleman over there.
Thank you. Duncan Hames, Transparency International, UK. Vladimir, I think your freedom must be a source of hope to political prisoners everywhere. TI Russia and its executive director, Ilya Shumenov, were designated foreign agents in Russia, and recently a warrant was issued for his arrest. This stamping out of civil society, and in our case, anti-corruption activists, is a playbook that we've seen elsewhere. You mentioned Belarus, but one might add Azerbaijan, and with the so-called Russian law, it's a threat that civil society feels very acutely currently in Georgia. How best can civil society resist the heavy hand of the state before it's too late?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for the amazing work that Transparency International has been doing. It's, we've used your corruption perception indexes for many years as sort of a gold standard in this field, and That's why you have the undesirable designation label from the Russian government. Take it as the highest badge of honor. And Ilya Shumanov is a good friend of mine. I met him many years ago in Kaliningrad, where he's from, as you know. It's very important for civil society to resist, to the point of your question, because unfortunately, in the early years of Putin, and this is where Russian society does bear a large part of responsibility for what has been happening over the past many years in Russia. In the first few years of Putin's regime, when it was still possible to resist, when there were still instruments, a large part of Russian society sort of decided that they'll stay away from politics, that they'll just sort of, accept this unspoken social contract of giving up civic liberties and political rights in return for higher economic standards. This has been written about and discussed many times. And by the time Russian society woke up and began resisting the Putin regime, which was around the time of the big protests in 2011, 2012, it was in many ways too late. So it's really important. It was really important for me, for example, to see the big protests in Georgia against this so-called foreign agent law. I actually got news of that while I was still in prison. This was back in the beginning of the summer, I think. I was subscribing to the last independent newspaper in Russia, which is Собеседник, which was shut down by the Russian government literally 3 days ago. And when that happened, my first thought was about all the political prisoners who just lost the last access to independent information, because obviously there are no phones, no computers, no internet in prison, only print. And in Собеседник, there were articles, there were photos of those protests in Tbilisi against the foreign agent law. And I was, well, jealous in a way, because I remember that that was not what was happening in Russia in the early 2000s. But I was also very heartened to see that Georgian civil society is not just putting up with this and that they are resisting it. And I hope that this issue of the foreign agent law, so-called foreign agent law, will be a big part of the discussion for the election campaign in Georgia that is coming next month. And so very heartening to see the protest, and I hope it continues, and I hope it continues in other countries as well. Thanks for the question.
Thank you very much. The lady over there.
Thank you very much. My name is Tine Essing. I'm with Denmark's public broadcaster. You've touched upon it already, but I was wondering if you could detail a path you can see to a post-Putin era. What does it look like, most likely, the way to get to that point for you? Which part do you personally think you can play in it? And what part do you think you could play in a post-Putin Russia?
Thank you for the question. Well, I am a politician, so I do have some ambitions by definition. Nobody's in politics without ambitions, but frankly, that's secondary. I would consider it an honor and a privilege to be able to serve my country in an official government capacity when and if the opportunity arises. But that's not what's important. What's important is that there is that democratic Russia. And so the most important component of that post-Putin transition, as we already discussed, to me, is that change has to be genuine. It cannot be, as Ed Lucas said, a Potemkin fake liberalization. There has to be accountability for war crimes committed in Ukraine. There has to be accountability for people who committed crimes against Russian citizens, like the murders of Boris Nemtsov and Alexei Navalny, like the persecution of political prisoners. There has to be a full accounting for all the government structures that were responsible for these crimes. And one of the biggest, well, problems is a weak word for this, one of the biggest tragedies, catastrophes, call it what you want, in the 1990s was that the KGB was never dismantled. It was renamed. That was it. They just changed the letters on the facade, and that was the end of it. Just imagine if that happened, I don't know, to Stasi in Germany, if that still existed today under a different name. That's unthinkable, but that's what happened in Russia. That needs to change too. And there will need to be a full and public reckoning with everything, with all the crimes that have been committed under the Putin regime, to make sure that they never come back again, that it's never repeated again, that this evil never makes a return. And in terms of if you're asking sort of more specific questions about the political setup, of course, that will be for a future parliament or constituent assembly to decide. But if you want to hear my personal view, I believe, as I already said, that Russia should be a parliamentary system, not a presidential one. In fact, if you look at the way sort of post-communist countries after the early 90s chose their political systems, you'll see that basically all of Europe, these former communist countries, have gone for either parliamentary or mixed presidential parliamentary systems. The only two countries that have opted for purely presidential systems were Russia and Belarus, and I think that's all that needs to be said on this subject, and so that needs to change. We need to have a parliamentary system with the checks and balances, with the necessity for coalitions, with the necessity to discuss and debate and come to compromises and to make policy in this way. And I also believe that Russia should be a federation. It's called a federation. The official name of our country is the Russian Federation, but it's a federation in name only. In fact, it's a highly centralized state where everything is decided by one person in the Kremlin. We need to get away from that too. And that federation should be in practice, not in name only. And that means much broader autonomy for the regions, much broader autonomy in financial and tax questions, but also in, for example, the ability for people to learn their own languages, which is not really happening in Russia today, in the national republics and so on. There'll need to be a lot of changes. And again, when that window of opportunity comes, when that day after Putin arrives, it will be too late to sit down and start deliberating on all those plans. What you're asking about, all that needs to be prepared today. And I see this alongside continued advocacy on behalf of political prisoners. I see this as one of the most important tasks for me, as well as for my colleagues in the opposition movement and in Russian civil society writ large, to lay down those plans, to prepare those roadmaps, to prepare that future transition, so that on day one, we have all the blueprints ready.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Bjarne Nørum, Christopher, Denmark. So it doesn't sound like that the fact that you've been imprisoned and other people have been imprisoned is scaring people from showing any opposition, or does the scare tactic work for Putin?
Could you repeat just the last part?
Does the scare tactic work?
Scare tactic.
Yes and no. It works on a large scale, of course, because people in Russia know what happens to those who publicly oppose Vladimir Putin. People know that he can lose your job, you can be harassed, you can be arrested, or you can be killed if you oppose this regime. And especially since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in February 2022, the Kremlin has stepped up this repression in a very visible way. I mean, just look at the sentences that are being handed to people for opposing the war. The average sentence for murder in Russia, the average prison sentence for murder, is between 9 and 11 years in prison. I received 25 years in prison for 5 public speeches opposing Putin, opposing the dictatorship, opposing the war in Ukraine. And it's done deliberately. It's done so that people see what happens to those who dare to oppose. And so, of course, that's a major reason for the fact that there are no, mass protests on the streets, as there would have been in any other situation. But on the other side, and I answered your question yes and no, and the no part is, frankly, it's amazing to me in a very good way, and it's one of the things that makes me proud of my country, because if you look at just the figures for the people who were detained by police, who had administrative charges brought against them, who were criminally indicted for publicly speaking out against the war in Ukraine since February of 2022, those numbers run in the tens of thousands. Back in August 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia to crush the Prague Spring, 7 people came out onto Red Square in Moscow in a silent demonstration of protest. Now, of course, they were immediately arrested and sent off to prisons and labor camps and psychiatric hospitals. But in my view, those 7 people saved the honor of the entire Russian nation back then. And the next day after the demonstration, one of the leading Prague newspapers, Literárny Listík, while Soviet tanks were rolling on the streets of Prague, they wrote in an editorial that we now have 7 reasons for which we will never be able to hate the Russian people. That was 7 people back in '68. Today there are tens of thousands. And when I look at these numbers, these are figures from Overday Info, which was one of the most respected human rights organizations in Russia. The latest figures that I've seen, more than 20,000 police detentions for people openly protesting against the war, more than 9,000 administrative cases brought against people, which is just one step away from criminal prosecution, and more than 1,000 people actually criminally prosecuted. That is, arrested, charged, indicted, tried, convicted, or imprisoned for publicly opposing Putin's war in Ukraine. And so if back in 1968, the world had 7 reasons not to hate the Russian people, today there are tens of thousands.
Thank you. Over there. Mary Dejevsky.
Mary Dejevsky, I'm columnist for The Independent. You mentioned in your introduction the importance of political and international support in public for silence from the British authorities, even though you have dual citizenship. Can you say whether maybe there was more going on behind the scenes, or what you feel about the extent of support, official British support for you when you were arrested, tried and imprisoned? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for this question. My friend and mentor in many ways, Irwin Cotler, former Justice Minister of Canada, is one of the foremost human rights advocates in the world, as you know, once wrote that the worst nightmare for a political prisoner is to be forgotten. I often quoted this phrase back before my own arrest when I was advocating on behalf of other political prisoners. But now, having gone through this myself, I know just how important that is. And I can tell you that not for a moment, whatever hell I was going through, and I was just sitting in that cell, not allowed to go anywhere, not allowed to call my wife or my kids, not allowed to speak with anybody inside the prison. Whatever else was happening, I never for a moment felt that I was forgotten, and that was really important. And public attention not only helps, public attention saves. And from the little pieces of information that I was able to get in prison through lawyers and through letters, I felt that support from this country as well. I felt it in the public statements, in the parliamentary hearings, of course from your colleagues in the press, but also from officials, such as the former Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, with whom I'm going to meet this coming Monday, just to say thank you. With the then Shadow Foreign Secretary, now Foreign Secretary David Lammy, with whom I met this morning. And I thanked him as well, because he did speak out publicly on my behalf. And it was very important for me also to know that diplomats from many countries, but always including the United Kingdom, tried to attend my court hearings when I was being tried in Moscow. I say tried to because my trial was held entirely behind closed doors. Nobody was allowed in. It was, back in Stalin's time. But I knew from my lawyers, as they were going into the courtroom and they were passing the crowds that were outside, they said that such and such ambassadors were here today, and Ambassador Deborah Bonnet of the United Kingdom was always there. And in fact, today when I met with people at the Foreign Office, I know she's no longer in Moscow, she's changed posting, but I asked them to convey my gratitude to her because it is important. And I've asked also diplomats here and in other countries I've been to continue attending the trials of political prisoners, because it is important for people to know that they're not being forgotten. And so I'm deeply grateful for that. I don't know what was or wasn't happening behind the scenes, but to me, the most important work is actually not behind the scenes, but it's out in the public. Because unless people talk about political prisoners, unless people say their names, unless people show their faces, no exchanges and no negotiations will ever happen, such as the one that led to our release last month. And so it is for this that I'm deeply grateful to many governments of democratic nations around the world, including the government and members of parliament here in the United Kingdom.
Thank you. Gentleman over there.
Vladimir Nijinsky, Polish Press Agency. How long it could take to transform Russia into a democratic country? Because the problem is not only with Vladimir Putin, but also, unfortunately, part of the Russian society share that imperial mentality. So how to eradicate that mentality?
Thank you for the question. That's exactly why I'm speaking about this process of public reckoning and the moral cleansing, if you will, that needs to happen. This is why this was necessary in every country that successfully, or I stress successfully, underwent a process of transformation from authoritarianism to democracy, because you're absolutely right. It's not enough just to change the people on the top. It's not enough even to change the constitution or to change state institutions. It's important that society reflects on the crimes that have been committed, understands that it's not possible to live like this anymore, and truly turns the page and move on without the possibility of ever going back to this. This will not be an easy or quick process. Nobody's pretending this is going to happen, in a few months. In many ways, I mentioned the example of Germany, the eastern part of Germany after 1989, Well, in many ways, that process still hasn't been completed. When I was in Germany to meet with Chancellor Scholz a couple of weeks back, they've had 2 regional elections in the former GDR that were won by the extreme right and the extreme left. And I think that's testimony to the fact that that process is still undergoing in Germany, even today, even 35 years after the collapse of the Berlin Wall. So nobody's pretending, and I'm certainly not, that that's going to be, an easy, quick process and Russia is going to become a democracy overnight. Of course not. But this is why it's so important to have those detailed plans, not only for the formal changes in institutions and so on, and to hold free elections, but also to educate society, if you want to use that term, that we really need to change our ways. And to be honest with you, yes, of course, there is, a part of Russian society that sort of clings on to these old imperialistic and sort of totalitarian mindset. But I don't think that it's nearly as large as that Putin propaganda tries to pretend. And in fact, look at elections in democratic countries. I mentioned Germany, but there are so many other examples too, where people vote for parties on the hard left or the hard right. Russia's not an exception in this. In any country, in any democratic country, there are people who sort of cling to this mentality. But they're by no means the dominant part of Russian society. And I'm very optimistic about the possibility of really overcoming this trauma that was inflicted on our society by decades of Soviet rule and now by a quarter century of Putinism. But it's serious work that we will need to be engaging in. And we must not stop at, as Ed Lucas termed it, fake Potemkin liberalization. It has to be a fundamental, deep process where society publicly reflects upon everything that was committed in its name and on its behalf, where the people who have committed these crimes are held to justice and held to account, and we will make sure that nothing of this sort can ever happen again. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. Gonzalo?
Hi, Gonzalo Saiz, asking on behalf of Tom Keating, Director of the Center for Finance Security at RUSI. What advice do you have for the G7 sanctions community?
Can you elaborate a little bit? Why specifically G7?
Of sanctions in the past. So there's huge efforts to coordinate the sanctions against Russia to weaken its war machine and support Ukraine in its war. So do you have any thoughts on the effectiveness of sanctions and how we can improve them?
Sure.
And you also argued a number of times that the sanctions must be done in such a way as not to hit at ordinary Russians. That was one of the criticism of you when you came out of prison.
Okay, thanks for the question. No, I just want to ask why specifically G7, but this is a wider question, right? So I'm very happy to address it. Well, I've been involved in sanctions work for many years, let's put it that way. The 2 poisonings that I experienced at the hands of the FSB were responses from the Kremlin for my work on the Magnitsky Act, which was a law that was passed initially in the United States and then in many other countries, including here in the UK, a law that imposed long-awaited, targeted visa and financial sanctions against Putin regime officials and Kremlin-connected oligarchs who have for years and years made a habit of stealing in Russia and then coming to spend and stash away that money in the West. And this country, as I don't need to tell you, has been a particularly favored destination for years. The term London grad didn't come out of nowhere. And Boris Nemtsov, the Russian opposition leader who was murdered by Putin in 2015, played an absolutely central role in convincing the American Congress initially to pass that law, to bring some accountability for these people, finally. And then I carried on this work and working alongside my friend Bill Browder, so William Browder now, and many others to make sure that we do have this accountability for people close to Putin, and that we no longer have a situation when these crooks and these human rights abusers in and around the Kremlin who have destroyed, any and all principles of civilized democratic society in Russia, then come to the West, to your countries, and use the benefits and the privileges of civilized democratic society in the West. This is what these sanctions were directed against, and I'm proud of my role in this work. And in fact, to a large extent, my 25-year sentence, prison sentence, was not only for opposition to the war, it wasn't only for opposition to Putin dictatorship, but it was for my work on the Magnitsky sanctions, and very visibly so, very deliberately so, because the judge who handed me the 25-year sentence, who was appointed to chair my trial, was the very same judge, Sergei Podoprigorov, who jailed Sergei Magnitsky back in 2008, who was one of the first people that we got sanctioned under the Magnitsky Act in 2013. And they put him to try me. That was a very deliberate move by the Kremlin regime. And they really hate that. They really hate the Magnitsky Act. It was an absolutely brilliant piece of legislation that for the first time ever brought accountability where it was needed against the people who really deserved it. And so I'm proud of my work on these sanctions. And one of the things I see, again, over these past 6 weeks that I've been catching on, is how inadequate the implementation of these targeted sanctions still is. There are still people closely connected to the Putin regime who are freely able to travel around European Union countries. Just a few weeks ago, I read in a